Off we go. You guys excited? It's Friday. I'm not excited. I don't like leaving. I like this conference a lot. Hopefully my voice is going to last. For some reason, it's been going increasingly, and I went out to the pub with Liam last night. We started shouting, and I think he was talking about .NET or something like that. It just got me going. Anyway, we are going to be talking about front-end applications with ASP.NET and VueJS. I'm going to assume for this talk zero knowledge. So I'm going to try and fill in the gaps as much as I can. I'm going to talk about a smattering of things. And my goal is that you walk out of here with some nugget of something. You learned something. And I'm going to show you something I made, but along the way I'm going to show you what I learned and a few little tips and tricks and some other things. So that is my goal. I do think it's funny. I just added this slide just now. This is what you're supposed to do when you're giving a talk, is you add a slide right before the talk starts so it doesn't throw you off at all. I was standing on this stage right here. That is this stage. This is years ago. You can't read the title of that talk, but it's about JavaScript with ASP.NET. And that was 9 years ago, and here I am doing it again, and I think it's hysterical. This is what I made. This is, I'm going to just jump right in. This is the VueJS starter template for ASP.NET. So, just so I understand, I'm assuming that most people in here know what ASP.NET is. With version 6, I think it was, of .NET, they created the ASP.NET Minimal API. Familiar with this? Anyone? I know I'm in Norway. No one's going to ever answer me, but just shrug or something like that. VueJS, hopefully you know what VueJS is. If you know what React is, VueJS is kind of number 2 behind React. It's a front-end JS framework. I put the two together into this starter template. And the question is, how did I do that? What you're looking at here is not all that exciting. You know, it's not all exciting, but there's a lot of stuff going on underneath the template here, and I'm going to talk about that today. If you want to play along, you certainly can. If you're sitting there and you have your computer and you're like, well, I want to see what this guy's talking about, you can install this template right now if you do this command, .NET new install vue.web.starter. It's up on NuGet. Your version's not going to be 1.17. It'll be something different. And if you want to then create a brand new Vue application, you can now do .NET new Vue. And then this will create it in a directory called NDC. We have to do a little maintenance and housekeeping, which means we have to go in there now and to our application, because we have 2 directories in there, app and server. So you have to go into the app and you have to do the needful, which means you have to install all your dependencies, just like we have to do. So to get this template to work, you need both .NET and .NET Core preferably, and then also Node, because we are working with JavaScript. You do npm install, change into the directory, back to the project now. We're in the NDC root. And then if you want to run this, npm run dev. So if you're sitting in your seat right now, you could literally do these commands, and what you'd hopefully see is .NET doing a little funky weirdness. And this is where we kind of start diving into the details. So what we have here is ASP.NET playing with Vue, which is kind of weird because these are actually 2 different applications running on 2 different ports. They're actually 2 different web servers, which is weird. And so our goal at Microsoft is to try and get these 2 things to work together nicely. So what the team has created is this wonderful thing called the SPA proxy. We're really good at naming things. The idea behind this is that we want ASP.NET to be able to tell Vue and Vite, which is the builder behind it, I'm going to talk about that more later, to tell Vue how to do things and to be able to coordinate actions between Vue and ASP.NET. They've tried scripting, they tried tooling within the Visual Studio, they tried a whole bunch of things, and finally, I think it was Steve Sanderson said, let's just make a library that does all this under the covers, and that's what this SPA proxy is. So when you start the application now, what's happening is ASP.NET comes up on port 8000, and it says, hold on, we're about to redirect, I'm making Vue start for you, and the next thing you see is this, as it redirects off to port 3000 now to the VueJS application. So that's kind of the high level. That's what's happening when you start things up, and you have now a whole project that you can go then and make stuff, which is great. I wanted to really quickly also say that my goal with this starter template is, I don't know how to say this without pissing a lot of people off back at Microsoft. I want to make things as clear as I possibly can. So there's readmes everywhere. The idea is if you go in there, it's going to be kind of Wild West a little bit. How do we have these 2 things working together? So I have readmes in just about every single directory to tell you what's going on. And ideally, you won't get lost. All right, let's go back a little bit, rewind now. Why did I make this thing? If you install .NET, then you get a bunch of templates to help you start projects. We already know about these things. We have MVC, we have web app, I think it's web app. We have others, including Angular and React. So I asked internally one day, I was like, hey, what is the deal with just having Angular and React? I was diplomatic, as I always am. And they, of course, said to me, what are you talking about? And these are my friends, Damien Edwards, David Fowler, John Galloway. And they basically said, Vue, who uses Vue? Of course, they're trolling me, because why not? That's what they enjoy doing. And their response was, as I would expect. Have a good time. Tell us when you're done. And so I was like, all right, I can do this. I can do this because this is what I do. I like making starter applications. So I decided to go in and basically crack open the React and the Angular templates and then make this Vue template. And then I went about 10 steps too far. I decided that I don't like Hello World. I don't like to-do lists. Let's make something a little more fun. So that is what I created here. Again, if you want to play with this and go take a look at it, it's up at NuGet, nuget.org. You can just do a search on vue.web.starter. And then you can take a look at all the things in there. OK, let's go a little bit deeper. Why did I make this? Why do we care? I mean, it's a Vue app, and it's minimal API. These are two things that can stand alone on their own, and you can just get them to talk to each other, right? So why do we need to have these things together? Well, here's my answer. It requires a little bit of a mental shift. When you start going to these front-end applications and you have a back-end API like minimal API, we all like it. It requires a mental shift, and that mental shift basically is, what if I just blew up Razor entirely as my Vue engine and now went to having a full functional Vue application as my front end and separated that completely in the back end? And the idea here is that each thing does what it does best. ASP.NET scales to the moon. I'm going to make the claim that ASP.NET does not render HTML to the browser in a very capable, concise, and fun way that something like Vue or React would. We could argue about that, and that's OK. You'll be wrong. Sorry. We could argue about that if you want. But these days, people are making front ends with these JavaScript frameworks. OK, let's talk about the pieces that are in there and why they're in there. And I want to start on the server, talk about the server and why it's there. So again, assuming zero knowledge on this stuff, if you've never heard of ASP.NET Minimal API, basically, the team decided that we need a better way that has less ceremony, if you will, to creating a web application using .NET. So they went in and they basically got inspired by Node and Express, if you've ever used Node and Express, and Sinatra, good old Sinatra from the Ruby world, excuse me, and then Python, Flask. The idea is you have a simple way to declare a route, create a handler, and you're done. That's it. You don't have any controllers. You don't have any other ceremony, as they say. You're just off and running. This right here is how you make an API in minimal API. This is about as terse as you can get. This is the full application in program.cs, which is wild. Of course, you're going to do more than Hello World unless you're doing a Microsoft demo on stage and you want to show how terse it is. But this is the idea. But of course, we don't want to stop there. We have to have some goodies, right? We want to make sure that the starter template, or I wanted to make sure that the starter template that was put out is actually useful. Because to-do lists are great, right? We all like to-do lists, right? But let's actually maybe do something a little bit different. For instance, I added tests into the API. And I know that in the .NET world, it's common to have your tests in a different project, in a test project. I understand this. This is where we might get in an argument again. I think this is when Liam started shouting at me last night. I put the tests in the same project because y'all are kind of unique in that sense. Out in the outside world, beyond the Microsoft realm, I'm assuming that you guys are mostly Microsoft people in here. Maybe not. The tests actually go really close to the code. In fact, if you're working in Go, it actually goes inside. They go inside the package you're working in. If you're working in Node packages like workspaces, they start putting in tests inside each package as well. The reason is simple. Just let's keep everything concise and simple and together and compact. You don't have to use this, but the idea is I just wanted to make this as simple as I possibly could for everybody to get off the ground, so I wired up XUnit. The tests are in there, and off you can go. Now, I know that the idea here is that we don't want test code in production. We don't want to bloat our code, and that's fine. So inside the CS project file, which is our MS build file here, I have some directives in there to strip out the tests and make sure that nothing gets sent to production, and you have a nice trimmed DLL that goes up. While we're in our CS proj file, I do want to show you how the SPA proxy works. It is wired up inside of here. the idea with this thing is that we are telling it when our ASP.NET application builds, right, it's going to go out to Vue and tell Vue to build itself. It's going to take the code from that build, static HTML and JS. It's going to pull that in, stick it in the www root, which is the static directory, so it can now be served as part of the ASP.NET application. In fact, that's the whole idea. ASP.NET no longer uses Razor in this template. It uses Vue. It hands off everything to Vue. Vue has a router in it, so Vue does all the routing, and then when it needs to, it calls back to the API for the data and everything else. Here's another goodie I did, because I work on the Azure CDA team, developer advocate, if you will. So I added deployment in here, because the idea, the overall idea, is that when you get going with ASP.NET and Vue, I want you to be able to deploy on day 0, meaning you've just downloaded this, you're playing with it, let's send it up to Azure. So inside of here, we have ways of setting up app resources, which I'm going to do later on at the end, so stick around, you'll see me do this live. And we have a way to zip up your stuff, put it up on Azure, and then you can call your boss and say, we're deployed. And I'm going to add all this stuff as we go along. OK, let's crawl out of the back end and go to the front end and talk about Vue 3. Is anybody in here, shrug again, does anybody in here work with Vue? They know what Vue is? Yay, all right, that's exciting. Vue's rad, isn't it? We love Vue a lot. I had a whole shtick in here, a dumb dad joke. I was going to get you guys to say we love Vue, and I was going to say thanks and whatever. So just pretend that happened. OK, so if you don't know Vue, again, assuming zero knowledge here, if you don't know Vue, here is the most basic way to work with it. You have a library, which you're pulling in with a script tag. We have, it's just a standard index.html page. And then down below, we have some code. The code declares some data. It says we have an application. And we're going to take this application and we're going to inject it, if you will, into a DOM element. So we have a div tag up there with the ID of app. And then we're going to jam this code into it. And then from this point, we can build out our application now to be super capable and driven by JavaScript and to look something like this, which is super exciting, isn't it? But this is the idea, right? Vue now takes over, does the whole front-end rendering for you. The one thing I do want to show you here is that our application is very simple, but I have some developer tools in the front end that are going to help me with this. So you're not just expected to remember and know everything. When it comes to debugging and looking at the state of your application, you have developer tools to help you. And here I have the Vue developer tools that are installed for Firefox, but you can also get them for Edge, you can get them for Chrome, and so on. And at this point, you're going to say, neat, I can go off and build stuff. And I'm going to dangle you off the side of the cliff and say, go be productive, because this is all you need. And it certainly is not. This is not the way that people work with Vue. Right? People work commonly with Vue by using either a CLI tool, which is Vue 2, or nowadays they just use a script from NPM. And this is where the concept count starts to grow. And this is where, if you're using Vue, you have to be patient and do your reading and understand what it is you're doing, because it's a very, very powerful system. So here I'm just running npm create Vue 3. npm is Node's package manager. So it's going to go out, grab a script from Vue, and it's going to start asking questions about what you want installed. So here I just kind of did the baseline stuff, and we can install our Vue app. But now we have something completely different. Instead of just a single page with a script tag in it, we now have this full expanded application, all on its own. It's our front-end application, and this is where the mental shift starts to happen. Instead of having HTML rendered out to a page, you're now popping in components in there, and those components represent little individual spots on the page. This right here is the source code for your Vue application. It splits everything out into .js and .vue files. We have assets, as you can see, which are images, CSS files. We have components, which are the individual little tags I showed you before. Router, of course. We have a centralized place to keep data in the stores. And then the views represent our pages, if you will, that you route to. App view is our layout. And then main.js is where everything starts up. This is what you have in the Vue template that I'm talking about. You have this full-blown application. What powers all of this? Now you might be looking at this like, okay, I have a source directory, I have assets and a router and all this stuff. How does this actually get turned into HTML and JavaScript? Well, there's another engine thing behind this. It's a builder called Vite, and I used to call it Vite, and then someone's like, no, mais non, c'est Vite. I'm like, okay, shut up, leave me alone. I'm pretty sure they weren't French, but it sounds better, swearing in French, just like the guy in the Matrix said. Anyway, Vite will compile the application for us. In fact, Vite comes bundled with a web server inside of itself, so we don't even need to have ASP.NET running to build our front-end application. If we're in the front-end app, we can say npm run dev, Vite pops up, becomes our server now, and we can just build out the entire front end without any knowledge of the API, if we want. Vite is important, and I'm going to talk about Vite more later on. Okay, so if you run this application, you just did npm create Vue 3, and you run this application, you get this page right here. This is the Vue's starter page. And it's handy, I guess, because it tells you, one, hooray, you did it, and you're awesome. We all like positive reinforcement. And it also gives you resources for moving on and how to learn more and build out your app and so on. I think this is dandy, but this is what I also call deleteware. It's like when you create a brand new ASP.NET web application, you get a weather forecast controller. Yay! And you have to instantly delete it. With this stuff, instantly delete it. But all the same, if you don't know Vue, it's kind of interesting because you can go in here and you can look at things and you can learn the exact wrong way of doing everything, which is fun because who creates a component called the welcome? That doesn't make any sense. The welcome has components inside of it called welcome item. Okay, great, and you end up kind of just deleting everything, going to hit the documentation to figure out, okay, now what do I do next? How is this supposed to work? So what if we replaced this starter application with something that looks like this? This is my idea that I think it's better to show you the idioms, the stuff you need to get started, to move on, to build a cool application, and then hook it up to ASP.NET. So this now, we're transitioning away from what the Vue starter template created, and we're looking at the new Vue template. The idea here is to have a strong start. So this is the way the app.vue or the layout page looks. You have, of course, our imports of all the things that we need. And then down below here, you can see we have the head component, we have the footer component, and we have a thing called a router view, which just displays whatever the current route is. It goes out, grabs the template or the component for that, and displays it. This is one thing in here, the thing that says suspense. Does anybody here know what that is? I didn't know what it was. Well, the first time I used Vue 3, it's brand new to Vue 3. And I put it in here because it needs to be in there. But it's really hard to figure this out until your pages explode and you're looking at Google. Why is this one component not rendering? Well, it turns out if that one component is going out to get some asynchronous data, the application doesn't know that. So it'll just try and render everything and fire off a whole series of events, and then stuff just breaks. If you put in suspense, you're basically saying await all the inner components and then render out the full application. So that's what suspense does. That's why it's in there, so your stuff won't break. That's the idea here. Inside the Vue template, I added what I like to call ready components. We all need a header navigation. We all need a footer. And I also added a few other things, some blocking elements, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the idea here is you can just get started and start building things out from the beginning, assuming that you need some kind of multi-page application. The next thing, if you're building out a Vue app or a React app or Angular, anything, is that you need to start thinking about the titles of the pages. Descriptions, maybe you want open graph stuff, you want a Twitter card, Facebook card, something like that. How do you do that? Well, with Vue, it means, again, spending about an hour and a half, 2 hours Googling and figuring out, how do I install this package? Where does it go? How do I wire it up? And how do I actually use it? What I did is I just cut straight to the chase of what other people typically do, which is to create a thing called a composable, which is a helper. And it's a helper for your entire front-end application. And this one I'm calling Use SEO. And this basically builds out the stuff you need for title, description, and SEO stuff, which most applications need. And it's there. It's ready for you. There's also a default store. It's Pinia. The old store for Vue used to be called Vuex. I know I'm throwing a bunch of concepts at you right now, but these are things you'd have to do anyway. So when you're working with these front-end applications, you have front-end data. That's called state, right? And the state is reactive, and that fires off the components, and things move around the page when input comes in, and so on. And the idea when you're working with Vue is you want to put that in a central place. You don't want to consign that data to a component and then wire things up because it makes a mess. So when you have Pinia, you basically need to learn how it works, and then you need to figure out where it goes and what to put in what store and what not. So instead of you figuring all that out, I added 2 stores from the get-go for you. So you have a content store, which works with the backend API. I'll talk about what that means in a minute. And you have a default store, which handles your menus and your links and your categories and everything else like that. One of the things that is very subtle about this approach is you start now cracking into the idioms and the ideas of working with Vue, because Vue hates having anything embedded in the templates that's not code. Try to put that another way, you don't ever want to hard code any data or anything into the actual HTML of a template. You always want it to come from somewhere else. And so it takes a while to figure that out, but when you're working with menus, it's easy to think, well, I'll just repeat that component and hard code some data in. We'll have templates up there, and you work with it like it's HTML. Vue actually doesn't like that. Vue wants the data to be data and living in a state store somewhere. So I set that up for you so you can just get going. So how does this look on a page? Is this easy to read? Is it easy to understand as you're going through here and trying to figure things out? Can you understand it? And this is where stuff starts to get interesting. If I was doing a Hello World demo or a to-do list, then you'd be able to look at this and see what's going on with the Hello World stuff, but you probably wouldn't understand the idioms and the ways that developers do VueJS in the front end. So looking at this code right here is a pretty standard Vue page. Once you have been working with Vue for a few months and you start to get some experience together, you're like, oh, okay, this is where this is supposed to go, and this is how this is supposed to work. Right here, I am pulling in the templates, or excuse me, the components that I need. At the very top there, I'm also accessing the content store, which is one of the Pinia stores I talked about, my little composable, use SEO. And then I'm working with the data. And this is where things get trippy. If you're new to Vue and you've never done reactive data before, you're new to front-end programming, this takes a while to get. It bent my brain. I didn't understand it. What you're looking at here is I am using this state store, right? I am pulling in the getDocuments method, and I'm pulling in the documents data. And then below, I'm awaiting getDocuments, so it's going to go out, it's going to ping the backend API, which again I'll talk about in just a second. And then it's loading up that documents data, which I can then use down below. Now, normally, I would expect on line 9 there to assign some value coming back from the store, to assign that to the documents variable, right? That's not the way this works. This is not, if we were to do that, we would be blowing up the whole idiom of using this state store, where we're working with state now. We're telling the state store to go fill up the documents. And this is how you're supposed to do it from the top level component, so all the components down the line can just listen to the documents and use it. It's interesting to get your head around this stuff, but it's absolutely fascinating. So again, my goal here is to get you down working as quickly as I can in the idiomatic good way. This is the layout for the home page. And here I have a component that I love. I'm using Tailwind, and I'm going to talk about Tailwind CSS in a second. But the next thing that you should typically do when working with Vue is you think about, well, how am I going to lay my page out? Where are the components going to go, and how is this going to look? And then you think about blocking your page, and you go, okay, well, I need things centered in a 1280 pixel wide block, or 1200 pixel, or 1100, whatever sizing you guys want to go with. How do I do that with Tailwind? Well, you don't want to think about that when you're working with Vue. What you ideally want to do is have a component that wraps things in a 1280 block. I made that for you, so it's right there. You just wrap everything in a 1280 block. And then we have some sections in there called Hero and Resources, which is already some components I made. And at this point, I need to stop, because I would be doing just a little too much. I start having fun when I make these starter templates, like, ooh, they'll need this, they'll need that. Let's add this, let's add that. And I'm like, no, don't go too far. Let's stop with the front end. We've got some ready components. I've wired up some stores. I've got you down on a good path, which I think is the point of a starter template. Let's switch now to the back end. Again, let's see what goodies we have on the back end. If you work with web applications these days, you know that you're going to need a headless CMS or some form of CMS. Ideally, you know what this is. If you don't know what it is, a headless CMS is basically a service that runs somewhere that sends text and content down to your pages. And the idea is that text and content should not be in your local database or on your local pages, because they're going to go through versioning and updates from other teams at your company, marketing teams usually. And they need access to it, and they need their own rules wrapped around it, and they have their own wording and understandings of it. So anyway, you can just pull that into the application. That's great when you get a year down the line and then your company is baked around this thing, but when you're getting started, there's kind of a weird line between doing a good thing and then just getting something up and running. So what I made is a very simple Markdown CMS. This is inspired by Nuxt content. Nuxt is a framework built on top of Vue, if you don't know. It's like Next.js is built on top of React. You have Nuxt that's built on top of Vue. I hate the name. I hate that it sounds so much like Next, but sometimes we don't get what we want in life, and I'm going to have to be okay with that. So we have Nuxt content, which is an optional package that comes with Nuxt. We don't have to think about that, but it is a Markdown CMS. And the idea here is that we have a document object floating around back in our ASP.NET minimal API, as well as a content library. I'll show you that document object in just a second, but the idea here is that we have this content library. It's pulling these Markdown documents off disk. It's digesting them, and it's allowing us to query them, because they're IList, or do I have IEnumerable? I can't remember. I think it's IEnumerable. That we can then query and get access to any document based on any bit of data that's in that document. We serve those documents through the API. As you can see right here, we have the API endpoint for the content being expressed through API in the API directory, content.cs. This is just a route that you can then ping from the front end where you say, I need some content for this page. I'm on the home page, and a bunch of documents are sent down. I'll show you what those look like in just a second, but the net effect is that on your home page now, you have 4 blocks. You can have as many blocks as you want. Each one of those blocks is a Markdown document. So we have a hero section with a title and an image. We have a subtitle or a lead, if you want to call it that. We have feature blocks, again, with titles, icons, and blah, 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 blah. All this content, right? So we can query our back end for this, and we can get a Markdown document down, and then we have fun and just show our page and not have to worry about embedded HTML. Where is this content, or what does it look like? The content lives in the www root directory, in the content directory, and you can separate things out as you like. All it has to do is live in the content directory. And inside of there, I have a simple directory called home. So this is the stuff I want to show on the home page. When I query for this from my front end, I just say, give me the stuff from content home. And it returns all these documents here that you can see in the home directory. It turns them all down as objects to me, JSON objects, and I can then show as I like, with the Markdown rendered as HTML. The Markdown is simple front matter on top and then Markdown on the bottom. Hopefully you know what front matter is. It's just YAML, metadata for the document. It's a typical way that static blogs work, like Hugo and Jekyll and others, GitHub pages. And so that's it. That's all the Markdown is. I tried not to go too crazy with this. I just figured it's better than a weather forecast controller. You know, maybe you're going to use this to get some stuff in production, get it up, without having to embed any markup in your actual Vue application. If you've worked with CMS, you know that it can be powerful. It can also be a nightmare. People take their CMS very seriously. You end up with these lexical topographies and all this weird wording just to get something shown on a page. I have just made this as simple as I can, so you have a basic document. And the document has a bunch of properties in it. And those properties are filled by YAML.net as long as they correspond to a given key. So you can see here I have one for title, summary, index, icon, image. I have a few more down there. I didn't want to go too crazy. You're free to use this as a base class to describe other documents as you like. If Markdown fits your workflow, hooray. It gets you off the ground. It gets you up and running, which is the goal here. If you want to use Contentful or Prismic or another system like that, go for it. It's up to you. I'm just trying to, as I keep saying, get you ready and going quickly. Switching back now to the front end, because we have defined the documents on the back end, we can now use them as objects in the front end, which means our components can then be built to reflect that. Now, I didn't try and bind these concepts together and violate every rule of programming, but when you're talking about little content pieces, we have titles, we have subtitles, we have images, we have all kinds of things, right? So you can kind of just work with this stuff and go with it. And the idea is, in this component, I'm rendering things out that I expect from the API, and I don't have to think about it. I don't have to do anything clever or one-off. It's just built, ready, and made. I got all these components from tailblocks.cc. I like Tailwind a lot. I'll talk about Tailwind in a minute. I know that people either love it or hate it. But the idea here is tailblocks.cc is a free resource, and you can go there and grab some components. They have a bunch. They give you the HTML and the markup. Jam them in your components, take the content from the API, and stick it in to where the lorem ipsum ready-made gluten placeholder content is. And what else was I going to say about that? I believe that's it. Anyway, the whole point here is that Tailwind has a bunch of components around the web that you can go and grab. Okay, speaking of Tailwind, does anybody here work with Tailwind? Shrug. Yay! So some people know what it is. Tailwind is a little controversial in that it can easily lead to shouting matches. I love the pitch here. This is great. I just wanted to talk about Tailwind really quickly because, again, this is one of those little nuggets that you could say, I didn't know about Tailwind, and I went to Rob's talk, and he was talking about something. I don't know what it was, but there's this thing called Tailwind. So the idea here, I love this pitch. If you can suppress the urge to retch long enough, you'll never work with CSS a different way. And this is funny because it's funny it's not funny because Tailwind has such a barrier to entry. Because you have to start working the way they think you should be working, but once you do, it is glorious. Because you get to write all of this lovely CSS. This is what keeps people from working with Tailwind. I pulled this picture from a blog post that a person wrote about all the reasons they hated Tailwind, which I thought was hysterical. And it turns out, and it was a couple months later, they recanted everything they said because they had worked with Tailwind more, and they realized, oh gosh, if I had just learned how to use the tool in this way or that way, life would have been so much better. But it's true. Now, I will say that this CSS that you're looking at right here was generated by a tool. They figured that out later. However, if you look at the code in the starter template, you're going to see somewhat of the same thing. The way Tailwind works is it gives you utility classes that you stick together to create an effect. There is no semantic, if you will, there's no semantic CSS in here. In other words, you won't see the term block wrapper. You won't see something that says feature box, right? You just build those things and tack in these individual little classes. They do have the ability to make something more semantic if you want, and I'll talk about that in a second. But here's the deal. And I was telling a colleague about this who hates Tailwind. And I said, if you just take a second and get used to the idioms that are in Tailwind, you really will begin to appreciate the way it works. So I'm going to walk you through this. We have a div tag, as we can see here. It has a width of 12 and a height of 12. You can see that it's a flex box. We can see the term flex in there. So what does this all mean? What is width 12? What is height 12? The Tailwind comes with this sizing system, and it's throughout all the components, height, width, margins, padding. Each unit is 4 pixels. And so the idea here is if you just keep that in mind, you can just nudge things. You can nudge margins, you can nudge box sizes. So here we can easily see that width 12, height 12 means we're going to have a square. Next, we're going to see that this div is going to lay out as a flex box. We're going to see it's going to be inline. We can see that the items are going to be justified in the middle, and all the boxes are going to be justified center. Hooray. This is our feature box. Rounded basically means it has really nice margins, so you don't, or excuse me, edges, so we don't have to think about how to round things using border radius. It also comes with a color system that's tonally compatible. So I don't know how many total colors they have, but if you want something to look orangish, then you just put in orange. And if you want the background to be orange, you're like, oh, background, BG orange. Let's have that be a light shade. So you'd say, well, 100, BG orange 100. Let's try that. Now it's too light. Let's go BG 200. The one thing I'm not doing is looking up online at all these different hex codes that I hope somehow go together. They've already figured that out. If I want my text to be a different color, well, same coloring system. Text, something color, something shade. And finally, we can see margin bottom, MB-4. Bootstrap has picked up a lot of this stuff, so if you work with Bootstrap, you can now see a lot of overlap in this whole utility-first idea. So if you want to have something be a little less verbose and have it be a little more semantic, if you will, you can certainly create your own. We could take all of those utility classes, stick them in Tailwind CSS, and define a new one called Feature Wrapper. And Tailwind would compile it for us, and then we could just use Feature Wrapper if we want to. And we don't need to know the CSS under the covers. We can just use the Tailwind stuff, the utility classes, and it'll figure it out, which is fine. And a lot of people like to work this way. But what the Tailwind people would do is say, you know what, leave it as a utility, because then everybody that comes in can read it, and they'll know what's in there. If they look at Feature Wrapper, they're not going to know what's in there. And what you end up doing with semantic CSS is you're like, well, I have a wrapper, but now I need a feature title. And then I need a feature subtitle. Oh, this is separate from the one on the home page. This needs to be feature thingy view title or a subtitle, and it gets to be nuts. So they kind of push you to say, well, okay, let's just do the non-semantic stuff. So let's talk about deployment. We've got our site up. We've learned that we now like Tailwind. We're building out our stuff. Let's see if we can deploy this. And I am going to do this live. And we're going to see if I have set everything up. I've silenced my notifications because I have really good friends out there that like to bomb my talks. So if you're watching, if you're up there, forget about it. It's not going to work. All right. So I have my console up. I am in the root of my machine, not the root, excuse me, the home directory. And I have my template installed. So what I need to do is do .NET and a new Vue, as you can see, NDC. Oh, and by the way, if anybody in here is a terminal person, what you're seeing right there with that IntelliSense is a tool called Fig, which I love. It's free, and it will set up everything, including the look and feel. So all those little icons up there, that's Fig. It's awesome. And you can install a bunch of other plugins. It also centralizes your dot file. So any of my CLI friends up here, Fig is rad, and I think it's at fig.io. I just want to throw that out there as hopefully another little nugget that maybe you learn on the way here. So we're going to do .NET Vue NDC, and what this is going to do is it's going to create an NDC directory. And there we go. So now we have that, and then we can go into cd NDC, boom. And if we take a look around, you can see that we have app and server. It's got a little wrap in there, but we have two directories, app and server. We have a package JSON with some files in it. We have an icon and a README. There we go. So now what I'm going to do is buy us some real estate, and then I am going to cd into the app directory and do the needful npm install. There we go. This takes just a second. Conference Wi-Fi, yes! Exciting. That is a win. You don't understand. That right there was the worst part of this whole demo. Okay, so we have that. Now we're going to navigate back out to the root directory. Let's make sure we're in NDC. And now let's make sure everything is working fine. npm run dev. So what's happening here is .NET is starting up. It's going to yell at me for a bunch of warnings because I write bad code. And then you can see the spot proxy is coming up. And then boom, there is the starter page. And let's hopefully you can see all this. There we go. It's not laying out terribly well because my sizing is a little bit off, but that's the idea. That's how fast all of that is. Okay, so now we know this is up, and I am going to cut out of here. I'm going to buy us a little more real estate. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to deploy this to Azure. And I'm going to do it using some script files that I made because I'm a script kiddie. I like writing scripts. So if I'm going to show you what those are if we go into server. And we can take a look inside of here and see what stuff is inside of here. This is our ASP.NET minimal API. It's a little hard to read because I'm getting some wrapping on this, but we have a couple directories in there, API, data, deployment, properties, tests like I told you about, but the one that we care about most is deployment. So if we go into deployment, if I could spell deployment, I can spell deployment. There we go. That IntelliSense is so great. I love it. So we're in deployment right now, and looking inside of here, we have one directory called Azure, because inside of there is where I keep all the scripts. I might, hopefully at some point, because this is open source, I might have other directories in there for, say, GCP, Google Cloud, AWS, whatever. If the community likes this and they want to have different deployment strategies, hooray. We're working on some for AZD, which is the Azure Developer CLI, also Docker and other ways of deploying stuff, but I wanted to do the simplest possible thing. And I'm going to go into the Azure directory right now and show you what that is. And we are going to have a peek. So inside of here, I'll talk about each one of these scripts in a second. The wrap on that is weird. Again, there's a README in there that explains how deployment works. We have an app service script. We have our site zipped up, which I'll talk about in 2 seconds. And then we have a zip file that deploys everything for us. So I'm going to pop out of here. I need to be in the root of the application, and I'm going to do something so nerdy. This is rad. I'm going to use make. That's right. I said make. So we're going to do make app service. And this is the second part of praying for conference Wi-Fi. This is now using our shell script to go up, and it is going to, hopefully, if everything works, it's going to tell Azure, create these resources for us because I want to deploy a web app. And then it's going to take the code and all the Vue stuff that we have in our application, and it's going to compile everything down, shove it together, send our application up there, and then ideally, in the real world, we would see the log files start to spread down. There is a weird Python error In the Azure CLI, something in there is broken, which sucks, but I'll talk about that when we get there. Okay, let us know. I'm going to let this go. We're going to do an asynchronous talk, which is fun. I'm going to go explain those scripts to you. Inside that directory that I just showed you, that deployment directory, we have a number of scripts in there. And the people on my team said, why are you doing that? We should be using Bicep and all these other tools and blah, blah, blah. And I said, it's fine. But here's the deal with this talk right here. This is going to go out on the webs, and people are going to see this. And what I'm hoping to do is I'm hoping to appeal to folks that have stopped doing ASP.NET and maybe wandered off to do Node or Python, Ruby, whatever else they're doing, but who still sort of love ASP.NET, and they might be thinking, I'd like to see what they're doing these days. Well, here it is. This is what they're doing. This minimal API is really appealing. You can still use your scripts if you want. You can still use your make files, which are rad, and I'm going to convince you of this before we're done. But inside this shell script here, you can see there's a bunch of variables and a bunch of comments. Each one of these is as transparent as it can be so you know what you're doing. So what I'm deploying right now is actually free tier Linux. It costs nothing to deploy this, which is a great place to start. Get it up on Azure so your boss can see what you're doing, right? And then, yay, I've been interrupted, which, oh, thank goodness. All right, that's what I was hoping for. Now that we're up and running, you'd think we'd be done, but we're not. There's two things I want to point out here, which is, there we are. This is going to take another 2 to 3 minutes to cycle up. That's just the way Azure works. But inside here, ideally, we would be seeing, and I hate showing errors, but hey, this is just, we'll get this fixed. We should be seeing the logs. Now I'm going to pop out of here in a second. I'm going to get those logs to run, because what's happening here is the service isn't actually up and running. It hasn't spun up. So the CLI is having a hard time tailing the logs, which is what I was hoping for. But we'll come back to this in a second and make sure that it's working the way we want. And where is my slide deck? My slide deck is right there. So anyway, the idea here with this script is you can go in there, change a few variables, and get things set the way you want. You can see the SKUs. You can see what each SKU is and does. If you want to know how much each SKU costs for an app service, you can click a link in there, and it takes you straight up there. If you want to know what regions support what for your account, I'll give you a link to that as well. So the idea is you go in here and you just tweak a few things. And by the way, all of these scripts work on PowerShell just fine. So I did these in conjunction with John Galloway. All right, so the one fun thing is our app service script then creates our deployment script for us, the zip.sh file. That zip.sh is going to be what you run every single time you change the application and you want to run stuff back up to Azure. What I'm doing here is the simplest possible thing that I can do to get the code up on Azure. I know that typically what we would do is a GitHub workflow. Maybe, or some other workflow through some build engine, whatever, that runs your tests, checks everything out, and makes sure that you didn't break the build with your deployment. However, on day 0, if you want something live, just get it live. Do the simplest possible thing, and then you can build on top of this and add your own process in. So that's what I'm doing with these zip files. Now I mentioned make. I know that this is a bit of a fossil. If you don't know what make is, it is one of the original build tools. I think it might be the original. All it does is orchestrate calls out to shell scripts or to bash or whatever shell you're using. It orchestrates it using targets, which are what those blue things are. Those are individual build targets. And you can orchestrate these things to say, well, I want to run zip, but before I run zip, make sure you run app service, so we have an app service live, and you can chain things together. I don't want to go into make too much, but I will say that outside the walls of Microsoft, make is huge for building your application and setting up things like minification of JavaScript and CSS and so on. So here, I'm just trying to make it easy for people to make an app service, and then when you want to redeploy, you just do make zip or just make because it's the first command in there. All right, before we move on, let's see if our site is deployed. It's go time here. Yeah, how's that? Woohoo! You don't know. See, I'm going to go and sleep tonight and just be like, oh my God, I might just pass out. This worked. This worked. I set up the site and I deployed it all within the span of about 5 minutes. That's the goal. And that's what I wanted to show. Our API is working just fine. It's pulling down all the data we expect. And let's see. Oh yeah, before I go here, I'm going to make sure, let's do, hopefully this won't spawn an error. Make logs. Come on. Come on. Yeah, we have all these weird errors like blowfish has been deprecated. This again, you can see it's from transport.py. It's a built-in Python library. So what this should ideally do, yes, there we go. Let me collapse this a little bit. So you can see, boop, 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 and there we go. What you're looking at here is one of those things where when you're starting up an app service and a web application on Azure, you have to figure out how to do on your own. Logging. What do you want to track? What do you want to know? So I've enabled logging by default on the app service. It's free, right? I'm not doing the paid bits in here, but here you can see, if we're able to scroll up and look at all the logs, you'll be able to see how the container started, what parameters went into it, and so on. So that's nice. And if you ever have a problem, you can set up instrumentation in that way. Okay, let's go back then to, all right. Let's see, what's my time check? Oh, I'm doing all right. I got 15 minutes. That's exciting. If I've timed this right, then I am hopefully going to end with a few minutes for questions, because I know y'all love asking questions. But I'm going to get to two of those questions right now. If you're a Vue person or a React person or a JavaScript person in general, you probably are going to want to know about code splitting. In the good old days of working with SPA applications, what would happen is you'd have this big fat wad of JavaScript and everything get compiled down into one single JS file, including the HTML and all the templating, and it'd be jammed down to the client. And you get a bunch of spinners on the page as everything took its time loading up, and you'd overload the browser memory and everything would crash. So what we do nowadays with these build tools like Webpack and Vite is that it will split that JavaScript out per route. If you have a multi-page application, it'll optimize it so that what you get is just-in-time scripting from the browser. So that makes everything nice. ASP.NET does not do that. And this is an interesting thing because, again, we're coming back now to, we have two applications running. It just so happens that ASP.NET plays very nice with Vite. So we can use React, Angular, and now Vue. But ASP.NET does not do any code splitting. Vite does it all. ASP.NET asks nicely to have Vite do this. And so Vite will chunk everything out, create static assets that we then pop into www.root, which then the one application gets sent up to Azure or wherever you're deploying it. The next question I always get this question is, what about Svelte? I don't know if anybody in here knows what Svelte is. It is a new and very, very popular tool. Another JavaScript framework that's come out. It's not even new anymore. It's like 4 or 5 years old now. People love this thing. And it basically does the same thing as React and Angular and Vue. But the one main difference between Svelte and Vue and everything else is Svelte does not have a runtime library. What it does is it jams out vanilla JS and HTML and then says, have a good time. And to answer that question, yes, I have created a Svelte web starter as well. So you can install this if you want to work with Svelte. Or if you want to work with Vue, you can use the Vue web starter. If you've never seen Svelte before and are curious what it looks like, here it is. It looks a little bit more Vue engine-y, if you will, than Vue does. When I say Vue engine, like V-I-E-W as opposed to V-U-E. And you can see we just have loops. We have basic templating like you'd find in Razor Pages or anything else. And we also have components. But yeah, people really dig Svelte. And it's the documentation for Svelte is amazing. So anyway, the option is there for you. Okay, I have a few more things to cover, and then we can go have lunch, which is exciting. Why minimal API? And again, this section is probably aimed at folks that are outside the Microsoft realm, and they're thinking, is it something I should really consider again? Is ASP.NET something that I should come back to? Because it was really bloated and weird and ceremonial before. We could argue about that. But the idea is it was kind of conceptually heavy to work with. In fact, if you go and try and find minimal API, any documentation on a landing page, what is it? Just give me a quick summary so I understand it. What you're going to find is the Learn documentation, which is dandy. And I'm not trying to throw my fellow Learn people under the bus, but when you're looking to know what something is about, maybe a tutorial isn't the exact answer. However, they do have an introductory section that does cover it. So because we're, of course, working with ChatGPT these days, I decided to ask ChatGPT, because I, of course, need a slide on ChatGPT. I asked it to summarize it for me, and it did a pretty darn good job. The idea here is performance. I would say probably over everything. ASP.NET's performance is massive. It's pretty amazing. It blows me away. David Fowler did such an amazing job. Damien had nothing to do with it, and I'm hoping that they're going to watch this talk online, and I wanted to make sure I got this out there because they razzed me pretty good about this starter template. Anyway, ChatGPT is a good summary of this. Speed, conciseness, ease of building things out, They're trying to take the friction out, so that's the idea. And of course, I couldn't stop there. It's ChatGPT, so I decided to throw some rhyming into it, and well, it did a pretty good job. That is verbose, or excuse me, verbatim, what ChatGPT thinks Dr. Seuss would think about ASP.NET Minimal API, which I think is pretty funny. And this is, well, I don't need a water break. This is what they call a water break slide. So you guys are going to giggle at it, and I take a break. I don't need it. Let's talk about that performance. I made a claim there. I said ASP.NET is super performant, and that's a pretty big claim. What does it I mean? This slide right here is from Scott Hunter's talk, who was the head of DevDiv for a long time. And he led the charge to bring .NET over to Linux and also to make it hugely performant. This is .NET 5, and his claim there that it's 10 times faster than Node is true. But when you're talking about speed and benchmarks, that's when the arguments really happen. Because what does speed even mean? And what does performance even mean? Well, speed, are we talking about CPU? Are we talking about responsiveness? Performance, is it uptime? What are we talking about? So to answer these questions, I went to Tech Empower. And again, I know when you're talking about benchmarks, we could argue all day long. But Tech Empower is often referenced and cited, so take this for whatever you will. They do benchmarks for a bunch of technology things, and they rated all of these web application frameworks to see how fast and scalable and whatnot they are. Basically, the idea is how many requests per second can they handle. And if you want to know, because it's silly, I was curious, what's the fastest? And it's this framework called Drogon, and you have to say it like that. It's Drogon. C++ web framework. Yeah. I didn't even know they had such a thing. That's rad. And of course, then I have to go find some code for it. What does it look like? This blew my mind. This API signature is the exact one that we're seeing in Node and Flask, Ruby, and now ASP.NET Minimal API. I think it's so funny. You register a route, right? And you've got your handler, and then all your memory stuff in there. And I don't mean to sound like a jerk, but yikes, memory stuff. I don't want to think about that anymore. ASP.NET is number 13. Or .NET Core, I should say, number 13 and 14, comes in at just under 400,000 requests a second. That's insane. I didn't really appreciate this until I dug in to make this slide. I was like, oh my God. Drogon comes in at number 1 at just over 600,000 requests a second. I think it's crazy. But anyway, the point here is that ASP.NET is pretty darn good when it comes to speed and responsiveness. If you're curious about other frameworks out there like Node and Flask and Rails and so on, that's where they land, and this is where the arguments really start up. Well, what engine did they use, and how did they tweak it? What variables, what settings, what configuration? All of that is very valid. I don't know is the answer. All I know is that in a comparative study here, you can see where these things rate. Are they good? Are they bad? I don't know. I'm not trying to make that claim. I'm just saying that ASP.NET is scored very well. All right. Well, I have a fun little vaporwave, synthwave theme going in my slides. So of course, I had a DeLorean slide in here showing the roadmap. I had to do that. What are we doing with these things? What's the point? Why are we doing all this? And this is where it turns fun. The next step is to pump in authentication. I want to do JavaScript web token stuff so you don't have to, or at least get you something reasonable that you can start with. That means you can work with something like Auth0. Maybe you can use Hanko, which is an open source version of Auth0, or some other way, Okta. Who knows? Maybe you want to use EasyAuth from Azure. Many people don't even know it's there. It's a little checkbox on top of your app service. If you have a web application, you can say, I want to use authentication with it. And then you get this cool thing called EasyAuth that does it for you. You get social login, regular login, and it just handles and manages all those users for you. If you want to know more, which a lot of people generally do, because so many people don't even know that EasyAuth is a thing, I did a YouTube video on this. You can go check it out. It's on YouTube, as I mentioned, Azure Casts. If you do Azure Casts EasyAuth, I have a 10-minute video that shows you how to hook it up and use it. Basically, the idea is the app service intercepts the user call that comes in. It intercepts the cookies. It intercepts a whole bunch of stuff and basically drops a header to you. So all you have to do is look at the header of the request coming in to know if the person is logged into your application or not. I'm about to show my age. This is a starter kit for ASP.NET 2.0, going way back. And this is really funny. Actually, I think this is 1.0. I like starter kits. There was the club starter kit. There was a membership starter kit. There was the commerce starter kit. These things were great because they showed people how to work with .NET and get up and running. People even built businesses on these things, which is really, really funny. That's me. That's the first talk I ever gave. I made the ASP.NET starter kit for e-commerce for .NET 2.0, which is hysterical. Steve Ballmer actually demoed the thing on stage, which was really, really, really funny. He was working with Brian Goldfarb, and I remember a friend called me like, dude, they're demoing your stuff, which I thought was really hysterical. But anyway, I want to make things like this. The idea here is I want to build out more templates, maybe down some verticals. So if you have to build a membership thing, or maybe you're doing some online screencasting and you need some subscription stuff, who knows? We can help you with that, at least to use them as a way of learning ASP.NET and Vue or whatever thing we're using. Okay, we're about to slide it home here. We're almost done. You can make your own templates. Templates are fun. .NET new, whatever, right? Templates are fun. You can make your own, and if you want to, I was seriously tempted to call this the .NET template, but I just thought, yeah. But you can clone this repo if you like. In there are all the descriptions and ways and things you need to know to compile and build and publish your application template on NuGet. Why would you do this? If you have procedures and code practices and, like, say, GitHub issue thingies, maybe you have certain flows that you want to use, you can put them all into a template that is specific to your company. New people come on, they do .NET new, our company, blah, 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 and they have this whole template there ready for them, including readmes with instructions and ways not to screw up. The benefit of doing this over having a boilerplate in GitHub is that this will, if you do .NET new and give it a name, it'll take that name and replace that name throughout the code. So the new project will have that, and you don't have to go through the renaming step for everything in your boilerplate. So this is the template instructions on the README. This shows you all the things you need to replace. I just quickly wanted to show that to you. This is a blurb that I was going to tell you about how to do pull request templates, which I don't know if you all know that GitHub supports these. Issue templates and pull request templates. We should all be using them. And this is where I get to say, please like and subscribe and smash that bell. I have to say that, right? That's it for me. I hope you've enjoyed this talk. And I do want to say, if you could take a second, please drop some of the cards in. It's how we learn as speakers. Red cards, green cards, yellow cards actually don't mean anything to me. But if it's a green card, you liked it, hooray. If it's a red card, that's even better because that gives me a chance to learn and maybe retweak my talks later to make them more appealing. But that's it. Thank you for coming. If there's any questions, shout them out. Whew. Yes?
Do you have any recommendations for Vue 3 component libraries?
Question is, do I have any recommendations for Vue 3 component libraries? Well, so there's a few out there that you can use. In fact, I think there's Tailwind ready component libraries that you can go get. There's one called Vuetify that I've been using, and I have it live on 4 different sites now. I like them. But what I find is that they make me mad more than anything. And to create your own component set is actually not so hard. You just have to learn a few things. So I would say my recommendation is to maybe use some UI, ready UI, like CSS framework stuff, and then make your own components. And that's usually the easiest thing. Does that help?
Yes.
Yay.
I have another one.
Go ahead, sure.
TypeScript or vanilla JavaScript for Vue 3.
Yeah, what about TypeScript is the question. And I didn't do that because I like TypeScript, but you can use TypeScript straight away with Vue. It supports it first class. Same with Nuxt, same with React and other languages too. TypeScript is great. I know a lot of people are going to using it. It works great with VS Code if that's your editor, and Visual Studio as well, because you get some great completions. But yeah, TypeScript is rad. Yes. Anybody else? Question? Anyone? Oh, right here. Go ahead.
You had this IntelliSense in a terminal.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. I had IntelliSense in the terminal, and the question is, what's the name of the thing, and does it work with Windows? And I believe that it does. It's not Mac only. I believe it works with any application. It's called Fig. And I think you go to fig.io, and you can see it's either fig.io or fig.app. But if you look up Fig terminal, did you know something about this?
I was just going to say, I checked to put it on my Windows machine the other week, and I couldn't.
Didn't work?
No, they don't have Windows.
So it's not Windows. Sorry about that. I thought it was.
Yeah, I wish. It's awesome.
Okay, it's not. Yeah, so anyway, sorry. Get a Mac. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Okay. God, I got to run out of here. All the red cards now start. Damn him. Anybody else? Oh, there's one. Yeah.
How's the debug experience?
The question is, how's the debugging experience? Well, there's 2 things I didn't talk about. One was front-end testing, and the other one is debugging, yeah. Debugging actually works pretty well if you're using VS Code, and you have some packages you can install, and you can debug your front end reasonably well. I would say the Vue dev tools work great. I don't know if they have a built-in debugger. I should know that. But along those lines, I think they do. I just have not used one. Testing is something I didn't show. I do have testing built into the Svelte template. I use Playwright for that, and Playwright is a front-end testing framework which is radical, and one of the cool things that they do is they push you to do to support assistive devices. So for people that have vision issues, so that means you have to plug in ARIA template or ARIA labels everywhere, which Playwright uses as selectors, which makes sense because Playwright has headless browsers. There's no UI, so it's the one thing that it can use to have selectors in there. Anyway, not to go too deep on a rabbit hole, but that would be a way you could do more development time debugging, if you will, using tests. All right, I think well, we're at time, but let's take one more if anybody else has a question. All right, I guess that's it, right? That's it. All right, thanks for coming. I do appreciate it.